Thank you very much. Good morning for people from Tokyo and good evening for people in the United States East Coast. Thank you very much for joining our 8th Health Security Dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. My name is Hiromi Murakami of Global Health Innovation Policy Program, GHIPP, facilitating this dialogue series. We're very honored to welcome a distinguished guest today from New York, Mr. Ted Schenkelberg of the Human Vaccines Project, which is taking an entirely new approach to fighting diseases. I also like to thank ICAS, Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies of Temple University, Tokyo, for supporting our event. The US massive vaccine campaign now changed the landscape, while Japan continued to struggle with the fourth wave of COVID-19 with delayed vaccines. Today, we're so fortunate to have Ted, who co-founded this Human Vaccines Project, and he'll give us a talk on such a fascinating topic of harnessing human immunity as the next frontier of science. We'd love to hear what his project is about and how it will affect our lives to fight against COVID-19 and beyond. The purpose of this dialogue series is to build a community for sharing knowledge and experience and discuss how to best prepare for future health crises and build health resilience. We'll have Q&A in the remaining time. For administrative announcement, please submit your questions in the Q&A column on the bottom of your screen so that we can address your questions appropriately. So let me introduce today's speaker, Mr. Ted Schenkelberg, co-founder and COO of the Human Vaccines Project, who brings more than 20 years of experience in biomedicine and global health. Previously, Ted worked as a strategic consultant in the global health and the biotech space, including work for a leading Indian health system and national initiative on reproductive health and antibiotic resistance. He served for more than 7 years as a director at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, IAVI, where he played a key role in building a $50 million global vaccine design program. Ted brings strong private sector experience, having worked as a licensed health and technology analyst at Carnegie Capital, an investment firm with more than $1 billion under management and administration. He also has served on the board of directors for African Services Committee in New York City, the largest U.S. organization supporting African immigrants and asylum seekers. And we'll have Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa from GRIPS as a commentator. He'll be joining later. He is a professor emeritus directing Global Health Innovation Policy Program, and he has also long been involved in global health arena. He is a member of World Dementia Council, International Scientific Advisory Committee, and many other institutions. With that, I'd like to pass the microphone to Ted. We greatly appreciate that you're taking time for us. It's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hermie. And it's my pleasure to be here at the at GHIPP. And I hear we already got off to sort of a shaky start with an earthquake in Tokyo, but hopefully it was just a small one. When I was preparing my talk, I thought back to our last family vacation, which was actually in Tokyo prior to the pandemic. And I want to look forward to some of the advances we've made in vaccines. And I think that possibly even in the coming year, that's something we might be able to do again and look forward to doing that. So I'm going to put up a few slides here and we will begin the presentation. So I'm co-founder and chief operating officer of the Human Vaccines Project. We're a global NGO, nonprofit initiative focused on decoding the immune system. We're basically looking to the next frontier of human health, asking what can vaccines, and more particularly, what can harnessing the immune system do for our health and advancing new tools against the challenges we're going to face in the coming decades from a health perspective. But I want to start a little bit for the last couple months on some changes and advances that we've had in vaccinology, and particularly in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. But let's start from the beginning. Vaccines are among our greatest health success stories in biomedicine. They've led to a dramatic decline in devastating diseases. They're one of the foundations of society, I think, as we've found out in the current pandemic. And many of us are here today because either our ancestors or we ourselves have had vaccines. But we think that this is only the first step in the journey. And I want to put that in context, particularly in this pandemic, but then also looking forward to the coming years, what we might expect and the opportunities and challenges that we might have to improve human health. So what we've gone through, and speaking from the United States and looking at the efficacy and the potential of these current vaccines, which is for us, we have a bit more light at the end of the tunnel maybe than you have in Japan right now, but it's coming, and I think that we're going to see a very different future with vaccines as the basis. And what happened over the last 13 or 14 months is probably one of the most remarkable scientific achievements in history. And I want to go through a little bit about how that happened and how it wasn't just an isolated event, but it really built on decades of research, and where we might go with that research in the future. So vaccines traditionally have been a kind of arduous, though really important public health tool. They take a long time to develop. And we often have a very high failure rate. So here are some major, on this slide, some major diseases and vaccines that we developed against those diseases. And we can see it's often decades, and in some cases, as long as 30 or 40 or 50 years from the time we identify a particular pathogen or virus until that vaccine becomes licensed. And we really, what makes this, the past 13 or 14 months so remarkable is at the bottom, where we see the two dots where we identified the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then we actually have vaccines that we're using licensed or approved in the public. And it's really, really a dramatically shortened timeline than we've seen for Ebola, hepatitis, measles, mumps, polio, basically any other vaccine. And so the question is, how did we get there? And how are these vaccines working? If we look at the pipeline, we see an extraordinary number of vaccines. We've had 14 either globally or authorized or in full use, fully licensed. And again, this is in 13 or 14 months since we first identified the virus. These vaccines are also highly, highly effective. And so far, we'll see how the current variants, maybe change that. But so far, the vaccines are looking remarkably effective. And here's some, efficacy numbers that we've had to date. And many of the vaccines are at or above 90%. Even the vaccines which are below that are still highly effective and potent public health tools to controlling and harnessing in this virus. So despite this advance, it really built on decades of scientific research, scientific investment, and a focus on basic research, and we'll talk about a little bit of luck in this case. And I don't want to go into all the details on this slide, but mRNA vaccines were essentially 60 years in the making. This is not something that just came up in the current pandemic, but it was really something that scientists, some in sort of lonely isolation for many years, had been working on. And so if we go all the way back to 1961, that was the discovery of mRNA. It wasn't known before that. And in the coming decades, it became apparent that mRNA could be a powerful tool for vaccines or therapeutics. And it wasn't until 1990 that the first concept of mRNA vaccines was posited. And then it was another 30 years before they were actually licensed in this pandemic. So there was a long timeline of research, of investment, of commitment to this basic research, to this platform, which we now have, which is allowing us to effectively respond to this pandemic and really give us hope that we're going to be back to normal sometime in the coming years. I don't want to go too much into the science here, but the other part of the advancements that we made was really on structural biology. And structural biology is the biology of understanding the structure and the makeup of proteins at a molecular level. This allows us to understand how proteins are shaped, how they fold, how they come together. And structural biology really goes back to the turn of the century. It's powered by a microwave technology which allows us to peer into these molecules. It drove Watson and Crick's discovery of DNA, the structure of DNA. And then in the 2000s, it became used as a basis for designing vaccines so we could understand the specific structure of a virus. We got a little bit lucky because the structure of the coronavirus that we're facing now is similar to other viruses, RSV, and then later MERS, which scientists were working on vaccines. And it has this spike that sticks out. And because scientists had effectively understood the structure and how those viruses work and are structured, they were able to rapidly apply that to a really similar virus in terms of its makeup in the SARS-CoV-2. And so we had a pretty strong head start that we could quickly apply to this particular virus. But again, it relied on over a century of evolving scientific technology, and then that technology being brought into the field of vaccinology, where we could understand at a structural, a protein, or molecular level how these viruses were shaped, and then be able to quickly respond to this pandemic. We also had a little bit of luck. The area that I come out of is HIV, and HIV was first identified as a virus in 1984. We still don't have a vaccine for that virus. And we've had over 33 million deaths, 30 million plus people living with HIV. And we've spent billions of dollars on HIV vaccine development. It's a really tough virus. And had SARS-2 been more like this virus, we would be in a really different position here. And so we had a little bit of luck that the current pandemic, the virus that caused it, was not as biologically complex as other viruses like HIV. But those failures and those billions of dollars that were invested towards HIV vaccines, and we've had over 40 different vaccines that are under development, and all of them have failed, have actually given us the tools and that to rapidly move against this current pandemic. And so some of those tools include viral genomics, the rapid sequencing of the virus so we can understand its genetic makeup, and that was done within days or months or weeks of understanding what the virus was. Because the HIV is such a difficult virus, we had to make major advancements in human immunology, so we learned much more about our immune system. Many of the platforms that we use today, whether it's mRNA, DNA, or viral vectors, you may have heard many of these being used in reference to the leading vaccines, were platforms that were refined for vaccine use during the development of HIV vaccines. And again, as we talked about structural biology, the application of these new technologies to understand at a structural level what these viruses look like, how they function at a molecular level, and really applying that into the current pandemic. And so we had a little bit of luck that this current virus was relatively simple, but we also had a lot of perseverance, a lot of investment, and a lot of years of scientific innovation that allowed us to rapidly respond to these vaccines, which look to be highly effective and are giving us hope that this virus can be controlled and that we can end the current pandemic if we have the moral, the policy, and the economic will to do so. So I want to shift the presentation a little bit from the current pandemic, and I want to look forward. You know, we're seeing this as something that we can control with these new vaccines, and there'll be a lot of vaccines. They're highly effective. But the question we're asking now is, where do we go? Where do we go from the success, and what do we have to focus on and continue to invest in so that we're able to meet the challenges of the coming decades? And so to kind of start from the beginning of where we should start is the quote from David Baltimore, and he's a Nobel Prize winning biologist who is president emeritus of the California Institute of Technology. And he's saying if you could put your money anywhere, basically would be understanding human immunity and the immune system. Vaccines work by harnessing and teaching the immune system to fight disease. But how that happens at a biological or molecular level has been a bit of a mystery for scientists. We know that we can develop effective vaccines, but we don't always know the underlying rules or components of immunity that make them work. And that's the focus of the Human Vaccines Project, is really opening up this new era, this new focus on understanding human immunology as a basis for future advances in therapeutics, in vaccines, and diagnostics. It's a basic research initiative which is critical to designing the interventions we're going to need in the future. And so we believe that the immune system, our immunity, which all of us share, is the next frontier in human health. Our immune system is a dynamic system which has evolved over millions of years, and in humans is particularly potent against not just fighting infectious diseases, but we're learning more and more that it's critical in fighting non-communicable diseases, whether it be cancers, it plays a role in Alzheimer's, and even heart disease. And conceptually, because of that, it's possible that you could have vaccines or therapeutics that's based on harnessing human immunity and the human immune system against both infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases. And because of that, we believe that by focusing and understanding this single system, the system that underlies the effectiveness of COVID vaccines and all the other vaccines that we have, that we can advance scientific research across many different fields and many different diseases by focusing on this system. So what's driving this? And we're really at this golden era of science. And we have potential and opportunities that really outpace almost any other era that I can think of. And it's driven by these advances in technology. We saw that how changes in technology and changes in scientific knowledge led us to be able to rapidly develop COVID-19 vaccines. But we think we can do more. We think we can go further. And these advances are really in areas like genomics, which every day is getting more effective. It's becoming cheaper. It's becoming more ubiquitous. It's in a field called systems biology, which basically allows us to monitor every component of the body, from our genes, our microbiome, our proteins, and we can see how that changes as a dynamic system. This creates a lot of data, and we can analyze that data in new tools, new computing tools, from supercomputing, as well as artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we, in particular, see this convergence of biomedical technologies like genomics, like systems biology, converging and merging with the computing field of artificial intelligence and advanced bioinformatics to allow us to understand really complex systems and to tease out the underlying rules or the underlying ways that our body fights disease through our own immunity. And so in order to prepare for the health challenges of the coming decades, we want to learn how to protect all people. And that's a major focus of the Human Vaccines Project, as well as a number of other initiatives. Because in the end, health is about people. It may be a complex set of technologies and doing very, very high-end scientific research, but we have to figure out how to protect people and prepare. Some of the challenges that we see we're going to face are continued pandemics. We are in the age of pandemics because of environmental degradation and our interconnectedness, our urbanization. We're seeing changes in climate, which I think will allow diseases that we maybe didn't see before spread to other areas, particularly mosquito or vector-borne diseases. We're seeing an aging population, which is going to make globally our population more susceptible to diseases. And so I think we're going to need new tools and better tools, and in particular vaccines or other modalities which allow us to harness our own immunity to really be necessary in addressing the coming changes in the coming year, challenges in the coming years to human health. And so I want to, again, look at and talk about populations, and I want to talk about people. So if you look at our lifespan, the arc of human lifespan, we're really most vulnerable to disease in the very early stages of life, as well as in the later stages of life. And if we think about our immunity to disease, this is when we're most vulnerable. When we're first born, when we're infants, we have immature and kind of naive immune systems. And these immune systems aren't ready to fight disease. We're still attached in many ways to our mother's immunity or our mother's protection. And we're very vulnerable. We have a high number of deaths there. As we get older, our immune systems decline, and we become more and more susceptible to both infectious diseases, but also non-communicable diseases, much of which is driven by this declining immunity. And so we think, looking forward to the future of vaccines, or more particularly the future of harnessing the immune system to fight many different diseases, we need to focus on these two bookends in our lifespan, the very young ages as well as the older ages in our lives. And this is where we need to make vaccines that are highly effective and really understand how immunity works in these populations. And so I want to first take the issue of aging and the challenge of healthy aging. And ask the question, can we lead lives that are not just longer, but healthier? And what's the role of the immune system in understanding our immunity in that? And we've launched an initiative, the Human Immunomics Initiative with the Harvard School of Public Health, which is really a large-scale initiative to understand effective immunity in older adults. And we'll look at some of the reasons why this is important. We, as the planet, are aging. This is occurring in industrial societies from Japan, Italy, the United States, but it's also occurring in lower and middle income countries like India, Nigeria, Kenya. We are seeing this extension in lifespans and it's been occurring basically for the last century. But that extension in lifespans is leading to new health problems and new challenges despite that success. And so if we look at Japan, and it's been a remarkable achievement, and this is similar to many other industrial societies, we've seen a dramatic growth in the length of our lives. And vaccines played an important role in that because we were able to eliminate or control many of the diseases in childhood which people would die from. And then other advances in antibiotics and advanced medical care have allowed us to push our life expectancy longer and longer. But as I said before, with that, we're facing new and more disease challenges. So if you look at this graph, as we age, and after about the age of 50, 55, and particularly after the age of 60, we see sharp increases in almost every single disease. And these could be non-communicable diseases, but these are also infectious diseases. And so this is presenting a major problem in our populations and how we are approaching health. If we take the example in the infectious disease space in COVID and our vulnerability to future pandemics, we saw that older adults, particularly elderly adults, were at significant risk for both disease, hospitalization, and death from COVID. And this is a graph that was done by the US CDC, which looks at the age group 5 through 17 as the reference, the baseline. And then you can see, as we go out to the right, the number of times that we have a risk of death by age. And so by the time you're 75 to 84, you have 3,200 times the risk of death from a COVID infection than you would if you're age 5 to 17. And a lot of this is due to changes in our immune system, declining in our immunity. So it's critical, both from a global health perspective, from a pandemic preparedness perspective, to learn how to really effectively protect adults as we age. And so I want to introduce this concept of health span and think about maybe aging in a different way. So as we saw before, we've been able to increase our lifespan to further and further heights, and that's a remarkable scientific achievement. But as we've done that, we've ended up living more and more years with disease. We end up with chronic diseases, we end up with cancer, we end up in treatments, and the quality of the last quarter or third of our life can be really low. And what we want to focus on, and the question we're asking, is can we increase our health span? This is the span in our lives where we're healthy, we're active, and we're not challenged by disease, and reduce that disease period to the smallest period as possible. And so this is one of the concepts that at the Human Vaccines Project and other people who are working on understanding immunity are asking. What are the principles of effective immunity in older and aging adults? And can we use those to design vaccines or immunotherapy of the future that are tailored to immune systems which are declining? And so I'll just go a little bit into just briefly what happens immunologically in our bodies as we age. And so as we age, our immune system declines, and it's something in the field that's called immunosenescence. And this is characterized by a state of continual inflammation, kind of a hyperactive immune system. our immune responses become disorganized and dysregulated. We lose function of key immune cells, and some of our tissues end up deteriorating. But we've also learned that age is relative. Not everyone ages, particularly immunologically, at the same rate. And so you know older adults who are very vital in their later years and others who are frail and infirm. And so what is it about, particularly the immune systems of these people who have this vitality later in life that enabled them to do that? And how can we engineer vaccines, or how can we engineer immunotherapies, particularly for diseases like cancer or heart disease or other diseases like that, that allow people to have that lifespan, that health span that goes along with our increasing lifespan. And so one of the goals of this initiative is to determine the principles of effective immunity in aging populations by really studying in-depthly how vaccines work in these populations, who responds and who doesn't, and what are the biological principles of those responses. We think if we can identify the biomarkers and the drivers and the signatures of effective immunity in older adults, we can lay the foundation for the therapeutics, the vaccines, and the diagnostics of the future for some of our really, really devastating diseases. And so that's a look at one end of the spectrum, and I want to bring us back now, which we think is another major challenge, to the very earliest stages of life. And so we're going to talk about another initiative we have, which is a newborn immunity initiative, which is really protecting our most vulnerable individuals, which are those who are the infants who are born or about to be born in pregnancy. And so one of the most stubborn health problems that we face, and it turns out probably to be a problem of immunity, is the fact that we have still 800,000 newborns who are dying from infection each year. We have another 3 million who are born stillborn, and another 15 million who are born preterm. This happens in rich countries, it happens in poor countries. And you probably maybe yourselves have experienced it or know someone who has. It turns out it's likely related to dysfunctions or changes in the immune system. And we haven't really developed vaccines that are tailored to pregnant women or tailored to newborn infants that give them this protection during this critical period. And from a global health perspective, it's really important because it exploits every single disparity we have in health. If you look at between industrial and low and middle income countries like Africa, the rates of child mortality are extraordinarily high. And if you look in countries like the US, where we have minority or disadvantaged populations, we can see rates of infant mortality or poor pregnancy outcomes at rates that are 2 times Caucasian or white populations. And so this is it's a health equity question, but it's also a question I think everyone faces. And so we can see a little bit here where we're seeing a lot of mortality, and it's really in the first months of life and in newborns. And this is where we have very immature immune systems, and we need to figure out better responses, better vaccines, and how to better protect this population. And it turns out, similarly to older populations, that inflammation in pregnancy it's becoming more and more apparent that it's a primary factor in preterm birth, stillborn birth, infections, and even neurological disorders that are driving many of the issues that we're seeing during pregnancy, as well as in the days after birth. And so if we can understand how to regulate or control some of this inflammation, if we can understand how to vaccinate better pregnant women, if we can understand how to vaccinate better infants and how their immune systems are working, because they are in many ways different than adult immune systems, we could make a major advance in health, and we could address many of the reasons that we're seeing newborn mortality or poor pregnancy outcomes. And so this is just a graph which looks at kind of the connection of infants and the mother through pregnancy and birth. And so when a woman's pregnant, her immune system is providing some sort of protection and interaction with the fetus. And the developing baby doesn't have a fully functioning immune system. It's not able to really fight disease alone, and it needs that sort of connection to the maternal immune system. When kids are born really early, when they're born preterm, their immune system is even more vulnerable, and this is where we can see a lot of mortality or a lot of infection. And so we're looking at ways where you can vaccinate the pregnant mother to confer immunity onto the baby or the infant once they're born. And we know that when there's immune dysfunction, inflammation, and sometimes infection during pregnancy, this can lead to a cascade of events in the immune system, which reduce that protection both during pregnancy, but also it reduces the protection once the baby is born, because there is this connection between the baby and the mother. And so if we can understand the maternal infant relationship better, if we can understand the complexities of the immune system and how in the cases where the immune system's functioning well, we believe that we can lay the basis for the design of vaccines that are really able to ensure better pregnancy outcomes and are able to ensure better outcomes for infants. And this is a critical global health problem, but again, it's also a problem that we face in industrial countries as well. And so these are some of the goals of our Newborn Immunity Initiative, which is to understand the drivers of maternal inflammation and poor pregnancy outcomes, and understand the principles of effective immunity against disease in the very early, during pregnancy and in the very early stages of life, where we can make a significant impact and possibly reduce greatly childhood mortality and certainly childhood disease. So these are a number of areas where we think we can make significant progress on. You know, we've seen a lot of progress on vaccines, but there's still a lot to do. And we need to learn how to protect our vulnerable populations, because these are the populations that will be most susceptible to disease in the future. So I'll just kind of transition a little bit here. You know, those are some sort of the big ideas that we have and others have in terms of where do we go now with vaccination? Where do we go now with immunity? And I'll talk just briefly about the Human Vaccines Project. We were modeled after the Human Genome Project and founded in 2016. Like the Genome Project, which focused on understanding a fundamental system in our body, our genetic inheritance, we're focused on understanding a fundamental system in our body, our immunity to disease. And with that, again, we think that by understanding immunity, and particularly understanding immunity in key populations and how it works, that we can advance research in many different diseases by focusing on a single core system that's evolved to fight disease, a system that we all have, and that keeps us alive every day. One of our goals is really to integrate advances in biomedical technology with advances in computing. We want to develop the first artificial intelligence-driven models of human immunity, so that we can, you know, maybe someday test vaccines computationally, or go through significantly large data sets and look for patterns and signatures of effective immunity that we can then use, or others will use, to translate into the design and development of new vaccines that work in populations where they need to work in. We have a wide range of global partners, some of which are here. You'll see Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, some of the major vaccine developers. And industry as well as academia realizes that, you know, until we solve these problems, we're not going to be able to make the advances that we need to make. And so we've been able to bring in government, NGOs, industry, and academia really to focus on this core problem of immunity and bring to bear these new technologies of systems biology, of artificial intelligence, of machine learning, to try to unravel this core system, this foundational system of the body. And so, you know, we think that if we and others are able to do this, that we can really transform health, that we're at the beginning of a new era, and that more research is needed. That this research, as we saw in the COVID-19 vaccines, it takes a while, but the results can be very powerful, and it can transform how we approach health and how we fight really devastating diseases. And it's important that governments and industry and philanthropy continue to focus on this, and not, you know, once we've solved or once we've put, you know, the current crisis behind us or controlled it, to not move on to the next thing, but really take advantage and harness the opportunity that these new technologies have given us and lay the foundation so that we can respond effectively to the future challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just close here with a quote from another Nobel laureate, Peter Doherty, who's based in Australia. He was one of the founding members of our scientific steering committee. That we're really on the verge of a revolution in human health. It's driven by understanding how the immune system fights disease. And whether it's us or someone else, this is something that the world needs. This is something that the scientific community needs. Our immunity is the basis. It's a foundation for our modern societies. It's a foundation for health. And we need to understand it, and we need to learn how to protect the populations that are still vulnerable to disease so that we have a healthier future and we can respond better to the challenges that we're going to have in the future. So I'll just pause there, and that's my email address. If you have any particular questions or comments, I'd be happy to respond. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's quite fascinating, what the Human Vaccines Project do. And I have a couple of questions. Maybe I can start asking questions to Ted. We have seen such a tremendous, success of this, vaccines developed by several, companies that is really effective, which is taking place. A lot of people are taking vaccinations, and it's really showing a, great sign. And what, this with the COVID-19 vaccines, what are the lessons you learned? What are the things that you observed that is unexpected or expected? What are the things that you saw from your perspective, doing this human vaccine project, you're professional. So how do you see, the current COVID-19 vaccine, either development or how this, affect to the people's lives? And I appreciate your view. How do you see the current situation?
So, I think we're still a little bit in the pandemic here, and we're seeing a lot of problems, and particularly if you're based in India or South America or some other regions where the virus is really tearing through these communities, it may not look so hopeful, and there's definitely policy and moral issues that need to be addressed. That said, on a technical achievement, we were stunned by the effectiveness, the speed of these vaccines. There had never been, mRNA as a platform had never been licensed or used in a vaccine, sold as a vaccine. And the fact that these vaccines work so well and that they're so effective and we could design them so quickly, I think was really it was a remarkable scientific achievement, and it stood on the shoulders of a lot of investment and a lot of hard work for decades before that. And so, we got a little lucky. This was a biologically, I think, more simple virus. Again, if we think of things like HIV or tuberculosis or malaria or even influenza, these are, complex viruses or pathogens that we, after decades and decades of research, we haven't made great progress on. So it was a remarkable, scientific collaboration and demonstration of technology, but we still have ways to go. And I think we see that with some of the diseases that we haven't conquered.
Okay, so we have several questions. So we may be taking some of the questions from the Q&A from the column from the audience. Okay, let's go to the first one. Okay, intellectual property rights are mentioned, that barriers for equal distribution, how much it contributes to researchers and their life incentive.
So I think that, we've seen that, particularly industrialized societies, that intellectual property is a powerful driver to bringing things to market, and as well as driving financing and investment. So you need to be able to, if you have a concept, particularly one that comes out of an academic lab, you need the companies or the organizations that can bring those, that have the know-how and the expertise to bring those to market, and you need significant amount of capital to do that. That being said, we all live in a shared world, and the things that are occurring in India, things that are occurring in Africa or other regions, until there's health everywhere, we're not going to have health anywhere. And so I think we have to continue to invest in tech transfer, in the building of manufacturing capacity, the building of scientific research, the building of scientific institutes and education globally around biomedicine, so that we can start to even some of these disparities out. And there has to be a moral or equitable component within the product development system.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. So this is a question from Professor Izuka. Currently, there are talks about freeing patents by the pharmaceutical companies. How does it help in distributing vaccines to developing countries? How many developing countries can be able to produce vaccines given that they require substantial scientific knowledge and capacity?
So there's growing capacity to produce vaccines in particularly middle-income countries like places like Indonesia, Brazil, and India. You know, I'm not convinced that simply lifting intellectual property protections would open up a floodgate of new vaccines. I'm not opposed necessarily to the idea, and I certainly understand the moral consequences and the moral imperative to bringing vaccines and medical technologies to people globally. But there's a lot of other steps and there's a lot of other issues that are occurring, particularly within the capacity to produce vaccines, the manufacturing capacity distributed globally, which I think we need to continue to increase.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So we have other questions here. You talked about aging and population and the infant population. So since aging society is going on, how to secure the resource for their health?
So I think that it's, you know, it's a little bit how you pay now or you pay later. And so we, you know, have an extraordinary burden of medical care related to these intractable diseases from Alzheimer's or cancer or autoimmune diseases. People become less productive, and the health systems become overburdened. And as your demographics shift, that's going to happen more and more and more. And so at some point we have to say we're going to increase investment so that those things don't happen. And I think now we have the opportunity, the technologies that we've never had before, where we can actually make progress against these diseases. We've already seen in the field of cancer, immunotherapies are working in about 20% of patients. Can we get that number to 40 or 50 or 80 or 90 if we had a better understanding of immunity? And so I think, you know, from a cold hard economic perspective, basic research investments and understanding fundamental science pays off, as we saw with COVID-19. This was based on 60 years of investments in other fields. And we had those tools when we needed them, when we faced a crisis. I think the same thing is going on in aging societies, and now is the time to make those investments.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have another question regarding infant population. So in order to reduce the child transmission of infectious diseases, how research could contribute for the issue?
How could research contribute to the reduction of
the child transmission of infectious diseases?
So I think that if we're able to understand how to vaccinate immature immune systems, or even more, vaccinate mothers that can provide that immunological perspective to the protection to the developing fetus, and even after childbirth through breastfeeding, the baby is still connected to the mother, still is receiving her antibodies and is still kind of in this immunological bubble. We can figure out better how that works, and how to design vaccines that are optimized to pregnant women and to infants with immature immune systems. I think we could make a major advancement on many different diseases that are causing poor pregnancy outcomes or causing infant mortality.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Keiko Watanabe. So does the success of COVID-19 vaccine get us close to the universal influenza vaccine?
I think that we still have a long way to go on a universal flu vaccine. I think that should be a major, major global health goal. We know from 1918 that influenza can be devastating to societies. I think what has advanced is we now have many different platforms, vaccine platforms, that are shown to be effective, but the immunology behind effective immune responses to influenza is really complicated. And I think we're going to have to make some significant strides in understanding our immunity, particularly to influenza, because it's an especially complicated disease and has an especially complicated interaction with the immune system. So I think we have new tools, but we need to make a major push, particularly in the immunological side there.
Right. So with this, COVID-19 situation, I think these vaccines or, these areas has not been mainstream, and that's much more focused on the other drug development. But because of this COVID-19, a lot of things is focused on vaccines. So do you feel that, maybe funding or the people's interest in this vaccines project, that you get much more focus or attention from the people in the various part of the world?
We hope so. I mean, as I mentioned before, that, vaccines have added literally decades to our lifespan. They're a foundation of modern society. We can't function without it. But I also worry that we have short-term, particularly in the United States, we have short-term memories. And so we have a lot of crises and then they pass and we move on to the next one and we think, oh, that's solved. There's a lot more we can do, and the issues around vaccines are not solved entirely. And if the next pandemic is closer to an HIV or closer to an influenza virus, we could be in a much more difficult situation, and we need to continue to build on the progress that we had with COVID-19 vaccines and the technologies behind them.
Mm.
Okay, we have a question about mental health. So how much mental health could be intervened by outside through some form of cultural perspective differences?
I think, is that maternal? I think it's maternal health.
I'm sorry, maternal health. Yeah, maternal health. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, clearly, cultural differences, so your environmental context that you're in, if you're in an area where there's a lot of disease, there's poor nutrition, there's poor access to care, if your parents are making maybe not great choices, if you have bad genetics, there's a lot of things that can influence maternal health and child health. But we want to be in a position where we put infants and children in the best position possible, regardless of cultural or environmental or their genetic context. We want to give them a start to life. And we think that understanding immunity better is one way to do that. When we give a vaccine against many of the childhood diseases, we don't really ask about cultural or environmental context. We just want to stop that disease, whatever context that child's growing up in.
Okay. So one more question. Do you think this focusing on vaccine development reaches to other ones, including non-transmitted disease, NTDs? For that, from research's point of view, what would be progress for such field?
So I think that we're referring here to neglected tropical diseases, parasitic diseases. This is still an underfunded field. These parasites are really complicated. They're genetically diverse, like malaria or other parasitic infections, and there's not enough research. What I'm excited about is that we have new platforms that we can develop vaccines, but we need a lot of investment in this area because, while it's not necessarily the thing that rises to the top of the latest public health crisis, this creates a lot of issues for people who are living with NTDs and their society. They make quality of life really poor, and they hold back economic development. So we need a lot of research there. This is an area where I think we can make advancement, but we're not there yet.
Okay. So we have all the questions answered. So if you have any questions, please, audience. Okay, I have one more question from Keiko Watanabe. So I think the question is how the work on infectious disease immunity applies to non-communicable diseases, NCDs. NCD. Well, the original question was NTD, so I was misunderstood with the abbreviation. So question was regarding NTD. So what I think Ted answered is right, and so I was wrong. Sorry about that. So is anything? Any more questions from audience? It's a great time that you can ask questions directly to Ted if you are having question. Okay, so there's another one. So what is the effective funding mechanism for vaccines?
So there's becoming more, we're in a crisis. I think there's become more and more outlets for vaccine funding. We have the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, CEPI, CEPI, which is based in London. Gates Foundation has done a lot of work. There's a lot of work going on domestically in Japan, US NIH. So there's a lot of areas that are funding vaccines now. I think, what we're concerned about is that where we're really going to make the biggest progress, again, is focusing on that system, the immune system, which underlies all vaccines, and the ability to understand how the immune system works, because that's where we're going to lift. It's a rising tide, which will lift all boats. And so, I want to go back to this, kind of critical plea to the global community to invest in that basic research, particularly around the immune system. And we saw a number of the Nobel laureates say, if we could invest now, it would be in the immune system. And so, we have to do disease-specific research, but this will advance the disease-specific research in vaccines across.
Dr. Kurokawa, do you have questions, or do you have?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for, I think, speaking to us. I think this is a very interesting, more comprehensive view. But I think we are really learning a lesson right now, because the world has been divided in human life, and also like some confrontation, national or whatever. But since a year ago, over last 1 year, this corona pandemic became a pandemic. That means affecting everyone, regardless if it's a political leader or people or wealthy people. So that is a testing of human beings. It so happened. And now we are fairly interconnected. So just we can share what kind of policy response in each country. And so I'm telling you all sort of some government people and political leadership, and just we can share and find out what kind of response each countries are taking, although the vaccine production is a common goals. And I think so that we could respond as appropriate in a better response by some other countries. So that is a test of sort of global world right now. And second, I guess you may know, in the US and the UK and France, over the last 1 year, #1 killer was corona over chronic heart disease, which is very interesting thing. But for example, Japan and Korea, because this is #20 was the cause of death over the last 1 year. So I'm wondering, what are this remarkable difference between different countries? And I think it seems advanced country affected more than others. And #1 killer in the US and UK, France, that has been corona, over coronary heart disease. And Japan, Korea, very low. Australia, also very low. Maybe I share this data with you through perhaps a PowerPoint or something. But I think that kind of, we are seeing and learning because it become pandemic. Vaccine is one solution, but the reality of what's happening in the last 1 year is some of the things of intrigued other sort of scientific mind. Thank you. That was great too, of course.
Okay. So we're almost time, but if there is any question, and then I will, oh, there's another one, okay.
Good.
How can we make GOF, research safer? GOF, what is GOF?
Yeah, if we could get that clarified, that would be good.
Yeah, could Nobu-san, could you tell me what the GOF is? Government, is there government?
GOF. What is
What's
it?
GOF?
GOF? What would be?
What's GOF? Okay. Gain of function.
Oh, gain of function of virus. That's a mutation thing, I guess.
How can we make gain of function research safer?
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's another one. Manipulating. Yeah.
Question?
So I'm assuming this is, and I hope I'm interpreting this right, this is talking about the variants, I believe.
Yeah, right.
You know, I mean, there's a number of things, you know, in the United States, we weren't sequencing the circulating viruses. We didn't know what was out there. I think that, you know, we're going to have to continue to monitor that. But one of the areas that we've been advocating for is a universal coronavirus vaccine. And this is a vaccine that would work against SARS-CoV-2, all the variants, but also finding the common structural elements so that it works against the family or subset of the family of coronaviruses. There's hundreds of these viruses out there. They infect many different animal species. We've already had 3 major outbreaks in the 21st century, SARS-1, MERS, and SARS-2. And so this is going to be a continual threat, and we need to make major investments in a universal vaccine, a vaccine that's capable of protecting across the coronavirus family, that's available prior to the next pandemic, that protects all people. I mean, this is, I think it's a critical area that we have to move on to. And it's not just the variants, but it's the family of viruses, which has been shown to be a major threat to human societies.
Right.
So do you think I will be able to, with your human vaccines project, will you be able to do that before our next pandemic? Will you be able to provide us the universal corona family virus vaccines?
It's a tough problem. I think, you know, we're hopeful in the sense that, you know, we now have, so we've started a partnership with Lawrence Livermore, which is a supercomputing center based out of San Francisco. And we can now do a lot of the modeling on a computer, how on supercomputing simulations of what the structure of these viruses are, identifying the common pieces of the across the coronavirus family that might be vulnerable to immune responses. This has the potential to significantly accelerate the design of vaccines and broaden their effectiveness across the family. So we have a lot of new tools, but it's a very diverse set of viruses. But we have to be in a better position. Even though this was a remarkable achievement, we were still too little, too late, you know, for the many people who were died.
Okay. I guess we'd like to thank Ted Sun for giving us such an informative and comprehensive talk. And we learned so much from you. And I really hope that, you know, your effort to develop, you know, more vaccines, more structural, you know, the universal covering vaccines will, you know, help us protected from the future diseases. And please join me with the thanking Ted Sun for his talk.
Right.
Thank you very much appreciated. Thank you very much for your time, Ted Sun.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Ted.
Thank you. So
Thank
for
you,
all
Ted.